Welcome to our journey of transformation. We're in the third stage of our journey, loving God with all of our minds, and today is the fourth lesson. It's called Discovering the Details of Our Stories. We've been thinking about the stories that form our minds and why it's necessary to renew our minds by changing the stories. Because you see, some stories can form a mind of the flesh that simply absorbs the stories we experience, allowing them to impact us without ever questioning or doubting these stories. And these kinds of stories can lead to selfishness, the opposite of unconditional love. Then there are stories that can form a mind focused on what the Spirit desires of us. Transformation in the image of our Heavenly Father, to love as He loves. And so we want to think about how these stories form and what are the details of these stories that we could change. I want you to think, for instance, though, first of all, about the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember in Luke chapter 10, Jesus told this parable, in fact, to teach an expert in the law about what it meant to love his neighbor. But he told the story of a man, a Jew, who had been robbed, beaten up, and left for dead by the roadside. And two men come by, a priest and a Levite, and they both react the same way. They see the man and then walk by on the other side. There must have been a story in each of these men's lives that somehow had trained them not to look at people with compassion. Whatever that story was, it caused them in that moment to judge that situation as a situation that didn't need their attention. And they just walked by on the other side of the road as if they would try to get as far away from the man who was injured as possible. What was their story? What story could have produced this kind of reaction? Then another man comes by. He's a Samaritan, a stranger from the province that was north of Judea, Samaria. He in fact represented the rivals of the Jews. The Samaritans were the Jews' rivals. But when he saw the man, he was moved by compassion and went over to help him. He immediately began to bandage up his wounds. He put him on his own animal and took him to an inn to care for him, and then paid the innkeeper to care for him. Imagine. And there must have been a story behind his reaction to the man who was injured. What was his story? Where had he learned, or how he had learned to have this mind of compassion, humility, and kindness towards even a stranger, even a rival? We can think about this in terms of a lot of characters and personalities we read about in the New Testament, what the story was behind them. Take the lost son, for instance, again. What was the story in his early life that led him to think that he deserved his inheritance early and that he deserved to be able to go to a far country and spend it any way he wanted to spend it? What was his story? What could have motivated him to do that, to be so selfish? Well, we all have a story, and what we want to do is examine the details of those stories. And the story that leads to the mind of the flesh has 4 parts to it. It's an experience, followed by a perception, and then desire, and then finally reaction. And if we want to change a habit of thinking, or even a habit of conduct, we'll have trouble changing that habit unless we change the perception that we have of ourselves that leads us to that habit. And that's what we'd like to see in this study, is how perceptions of ourselves lead to the kinds of selfish reactions that we practice sometimes. But we start with the experience. And by experience, what we mean is the memory we have of some event, some experience, a conversation, an observation, maybe a tragedy, something that happened to us, maybe over a period of time, or happened to us in a moment, or maybe even happened to somebody else. Or it may be something that we heard about. Nonetheless, it's an experience that has some kind of impact on us. And that memory of that experience includes the details of what happened, as far as we remember them. But our memory of an event in the past, of an experience that we had, always depends on the frame of mind that we have now versus the frame of mind that we had when that event happened. And we really can't recreate our frame of mind back then. We might have been tired, or we might have been alert when we had that experience. We might have been emotionally upset, or might have been calm. We might have been distracted or focused at that time when that experience happened. And so it's difficult now to recreate our experience exactly the way it was back then. And really, there's nothing we can do about that. We can't recreate the experience itself. We can't change the experience, and we can't be certain that the way we remember it now is accurately the way it happened back then. What we can do is allow ourselves today to experience the memory of the experience, allow it to flood our memories with all of its sensations and emotions and images that have been recorded in our brains, and all the connections it has to feelings we had at the time and later, maybe of pride, maybe of shame, maybe of fear, maybe of confidence or discouragement or abandonment even, or comfort or joy. Whatever feelings, whatever sensations that we connect with that experience, and experience those things completely now in the present as much as we possibly can. Sometimes we want to escape the memory or put it in a box someplace back in our mind, some deep corner of our mind. But it's still there, and it still affects the way we think about ourselves. And in fact, as we'll see, it affects our ability to love other people. And so if we could bring it out and experience it in some moment when we feel safe to experience it, not to try to remember it exactly in every detail that actually might have happened, but instead to feel the impact it has on us. Because what's important is not recounting the experience exactly the way it happened, but what's important is the impact it has on us now. And the impact creates a perception in us. The impact of that experience presently creates a perception of ourselves. When we talk about perception, what we mean by that is our personal way of viewing something, or viewing another person, or viewing ourselves. And here we're concerned about the perception we have of ourselves that is the impact of that experience. In a previous study, we talked about fear, the fear we have of seeing our lives as insecure or ourselves as unworthy. And experiences can cause us to perceive ourselves in this way as insecure or unworthy. And those experiences can affect our ability to be able to love other people, especially love them unconditionally. We might have experienced events like a loss or a crisis, something that caused us to feel rejected. We might have suffered the consequences of a wrong decision, and might have left us with a perception of ourselves that we are unworthy or incapable of something. We might have experienced such things as criticism or suffering rejection in some way. And because of that, we feel unworthy, or as a perception of ourselves. And there are really at least two different kinds of perceptions we could have of ourselves that affect our ability to love. One of those is feeling that we are not enough, that we're insufficient, that we're not who we think we should be, a feeling of inferiority. Experiences can leave us with that kind of feeling. They can leave us feeling ashamed, guilty, like failures, that we're incapable of doing better. They might leave us feeling weak and powerless, or abandoned and alone. Experiences could impact us in a way that would make us feel rejected and not worthy of acceptance, or that our life doesn't have a direction or a purpose. On the other hand, at the other extreme, experiences can leave us with a feeling that we're superior, better than other people, that we're far more deserving than other people. They might leave us with a sense of being proud and more capable, more talented, more intelligent, that we don't make mistakes, that we don't have regrets, and that we're always right. And please don't argue with me because you'll be wrong. We might leave us with feelings of independence, that we don't need the help of anybody, or that we are in control, always in control, and more powerful than others, or that we deserve more than others, or have special rights. But these are not two categories that we could fall into, but they represent two extremes, and there are, of course, a variety of dispositions and attitudes we could have between those two extremes. We might feel superior to some people, but not as superior as some people we know feel. Or we might feel weak and insufficient in some way, or unworthy, but not as unworthy and insufficient or weak as other people we might know. There's such a range of perceptions we might have of ourselves, but at least these two perceptions, generally speaking, of feeling insufficient or feeling like we're way more than others in value, are two perceptions that can hold us back and keep us from loving. And why is that? Why do these perceptions keep us from loving? Because, first of all, our perception of ourselves affects the way we perceive other people. For instance, we have the tendency to assume that they perceive us like we perceive ourselves, that they calculate our worth the way we calculate our worth. And that's just not the case. And at the same time, if we see ourselves as better than other people, then we can see others as a threat to us, a threat to our superior feelings. Or if we see that we are worse than other people, or not sufficient compared to other people, then we also could be afraid and not love. We would want to defend ourselves. And so what happens is these perceptions of ourselves cause us to be more concerned about defending ourselves and protecting ourselves than loving others, especially loving them unconditionally. And what happens is these perceptions of ourselves create desires in us. Remember we said in the previous study that emotions like fear create desires in us. Fear creates a desire to relieve the fear, to do something to run away from some danger, to relieve the fear. That's because fear is not a very agreeable feeling. It's not something we want to feel. It's painful. But it's interesting that those of us who feel like we are not enough and those of us who feel like we're more than others both have fears. We all have fears. We have the person who feels like he's not enough fears rejection, fears being unworthy, or like their future is undecided, no plans. The one who feels like they're more than other people fears challenges from people who might challenge their sense of superiority. They might be afraid of failing and think they have to always prove themselves because they know deep inside they can't sustain themselves. So they're afraid. So what happens is that our perceptions of ourselves cause us to have the desire to defend ourselves or protect ourselves in some way. The proud person, though he seems to be convinced that he's better than other people, still finds the need to criticize and judge. Why? Because he will always have to defend and protect his own sense of superiority. The person who feels they are weak and learns to defend themselves and protect themselves against people who want to remind them, or at least people they think want to remind them about their weaknesses and criticize them. So they'll also try to defend and protect themselves. Or it could create in us a desire to retreat or flee. The proud, superior person retreats from those who might challenge the opinion they have of themselves. And they put up walls of prejudice to protect themselves against such people, become very opinionated, and don't allow other people to challenge them because they're trying to protect themselves. What they're doing is really retreating from people, putting up walls between them and others, and refusing to make themselves vulnerable. Whereas a person who feels inferior or feels like they're not sufficient because of some experience they've had stays away from those who might want to remind them of their self-perception. Also, at the same time, it might create another desire, especially in those who might feel like they're weak and not enough or insufficient. It might create the desire just to resign themselves to their own self-perception and live with this perception without moving forward. But it's paralyzing, emotionally paralyzing, and takes away their ability to love. So these desires of defending ourselves, protecting ourselves, of retreating, or just resigning ourselves to our own perception that we have, are all desires that take us away from loving people and cause us to focus on ourselves and become absorbed in ourselves instead of loving others. And then what results is some kind of reaction to people. As a response, that's just what we do. We just respond to people. React simply to how others treat us or what we perceive them to think about us. The proud focus on themselves, absorbed in themselves, and so they constantly have to confirm themselves, prove themselves, use anger to control others, criticize, judge, and refuse to care for others because they don't feel like others are worthy of their time or their resources. And they put up walls, like we said, against the critics. These are selfish reactions, protecting self. Or the ones feeling weak might do the same thing. They might do the same thing the others do, except to make themselves feel strong. They try to achieve goals and accumulate things, not to make themselves as better people and not to improve their character, but to simply prove themselves to others. And if they love in order to be loved, because by being loved in return, it confirms to them that they're good people. But they find it very difficult to love unconditionally when they don't receive anything in return. Others who retreat might react to relationships, for instance, by not desiring close relationships with people, afraid to make themselves vulnerable and open up to other people. And so any relationships they have are very weak and tenuous relationships. Or they simply might resign and become emotionally paralyzed instead of trying to reach out and love people. So we cannot love people if we protect and defend ourselves and react in these ways that are only leading to selfishness. The reaction is selfish. This is how the selfish mind, the mind of the flesh, develops. Beginning with perception, rather beginning with an experience that forms a perception we have of ourselves because of the impact that experience has on us. And then the perception of ourselves leads to a desire, the desire to defend, protect, retreat, or just resign. And then we react in every way except a loving way. And what happens too is that once we have established our story about ourselves, whether we're better than others or weaker than others, and any variety of dispositions in between, once we establish our story in our minds, then we interpret all of our future experiences in view of the perception we have of ourselves. And future experiences only serve to confirm what we already believed, of course. If I believe I'm unworthy, each time I'm with people, I will interpret their actions towards me as confirming that I'm unworthy and confirming that they think I'm unworthy. And so we continue to participate in the same behavior and react in the same habitual ways. And our self-perception becomes hardened. This becomes our story. It's the bigger story that includes not just the experience, but also our perception, desire, and reaction. And the story ends in selfishness, the mind of the flesh. Next time in the study, we're going to learn how to change our perceptions of ourselves that can lead us to love as the Father loves. So until then, may God bless you.